Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Polaroid, which is currently on Netflix. So, Polaroid, I honestly thought was an interesting movie. Because at first I thought it was like, oh my god, this is going to be the most, formulaic kind of movie. I thought, there was nothing going to be smart or intelligent about this film. And I thought that also, oh, they're going to come up with the solution at the tail end of the movie, which technically that is what happens. Right out of the gate, I immediately figured out, how to beat this villain or what would be the strategy, which they didn't go and play into that very much in this movie either. But the killer in this movie does have a backstory, and it seems that we end up having two stories to tell. I actually liked the very first story, but then you end up finding out the real story, and you're like, ah, well, that just sucks. I would have liked the first story, because the second story just seems like, okay, so why is this person just going after, everyone in the photos? That's just, that just makes this person just a Freddy Krueger-esque, character. Oh, no. Anyways, so going into this movie, at first I thought it was a Hallmark horror kind of movie, where it seems like they're trying as much as possible to not have this movie be anywhere gruesome. The only problem that I probably really have with this movie is it is a simple movie. It is also one of those movies where you really have to just watch this film in pitch black darkness, because I was watching it here on this device, which is my tablet, and I was kind of going hey, I want to watch the movie. I'm trying to adjust because I would just consistently have this thing called glare, or I would just have to forcibly be able to adjust so I can watch this movie without turning all my lights off, because I'm just lazy. Because I'm why would I want to turn off my lights to watch this film? I don't think it's going to be good enough to garner me having to flip a switch just to watch a film that may or may not be good enough. But I started to actually get really interested in the further on of this movie, because they start to do interesting things with the photos. And I was like, well, okay, that's just going to lead us up to the solution of this film. But eventually it gets there. So yeah, when we get to spoilers, I will immediately go into the fact of how they beat this thing, and I will immediately go with what my strategy would have been to, after the very first body was to drop, coincidentally, these people didn't tie these bodies dropping with these photos, because they're just maybe it's just a coincidence. And then, really, Bird, what a goofy name. Bird, the main character, Bird, is to have this photo and just I think it's because of this, because I Sherlock Holmes this, mother, because no one else was smart enough to think of that. You would have thought immediately when Bird would have just well, yeah, I took a photo of this person, and really recently with this weird, interesting Polaroid camera, and then I took this person's photo with said same so you would have thought she would have probably tied it in. But yeah, there is also this Goosebumps episode called Say Cheese and Die, where a lot of people would probably make the conclusion that somebody might have gotten this idea possibly from watching Goosebumps. We'll never know. Unless we actually ask the creator of this movie, where did he get or she get this whoever this person is, how did they get this idea from? Maybe they just liked the kind of retro thing, and plus also people are to love nostalgic retro-ish things that are to eventually come back and kill people. But yeah, so with that said, teeing it up, what is this movie really about? So without a doubt, we end up having this main killer or main character, because she basically is technically a killer also. She's technically tied to this. She's She's technically a co-killer, so she should go to prison for the rest of her life. Bird is this girl who is to seemingly be uh, this girl that is to weirdly wear scarves a lot, and so she is to be called like Scarf Girl. She's kind of the outsider of this story, and it seems that eventually they try to just kind of like have her not be such an outsider. But it seems that this girl seems very similar uh, to our other character, which they base this story on. So eventually, we have Bird who goes into this antique store and is to eventually be given this Polaroid camera, and she's like, "Oh my god, this is the rarest Polaroid camera ever." Like, oh my god, like there's only so many people left in the world that have this Polaroid. Wow, this is great. So she goes and takes this thing and is to go to this Halloween party, of course, because I guess in a horror movie you have to have a Halloween party. This girl goes to this Halloween party, takes photos of her friends, and so all of a sudden, as she's starting to slowly but surely notice that people's bodies are starting to drop, she is to take these photos to her friends and realize, like, yeah, I had taken this photo, and weirdly there was some kind of shadow or smudge that was to be on this photo, and so it seems to consistently be moving from photo to photo, this shadow. And so all of a sudden these people are to like, well, like what can we do with these photos to try and like try to shift to have it be that we're not going to be next. Because again, when you have movies possibly like a Final Destination, or quite possibly like God, what was the other one, like Wish Upon, where eventually the girl in that movie makes a wish, and then one of her friends randomly that she knows, acquaintances of hers, eventually start to die off slowly but surely, and then eventually her friends have to kind of like give her a heads up that, hey, maybe you should just stop wishing and getting all those 7 wishes out, because eventually you're probably going to die after all those 7 wishes are done. And this girl's like, but what if I can just do one more wish? And the like, but you're probably gonna die after the 7th wish is to be done. She's like, well, maybe I'll just do the 6 wishes, and then I'll just uh keep this thing at bay. And it's just like, no, she's gonna be so tempted to just do that one last wish. Something's gonna come up, like her life is just gonna go to, and then she's gonna need this last wish for something. Like she's gonna ask for a bajillion dollars, and a bajillion dollars is gonna happen. Which I don't even think that girl even wishes for that. So, uh, so moving on. So eventually, it seems that there is to be this entity that seems to have eventually a weakness of heat, or like the same kind of weakness a photo would have. And because this monster at some points being in certain environments isn't fully developed, I guess. So you get to see bits and pieces of this monster, um, because it needs kind of like a dark room or just a certain kind of environment to play to its strengths. So eventually, one by one, certain people end up dying, and so now Bird has to come up with figuring out how uh, this camera came to be. And so eventually she has to go and research and find out who was the last person who owned this camera. And coincidentally, it ends up being this Roland guy. And so she ends up going to this home to find the backstory of this Roland guy and his daughter. And so that leads us to come right back around to uh, finding out that there is some connection in town with this camera, and so they have to go and seek that out to eventually try to come to some kind of conclusion to this story, to just be like, well, more than likely, if we Final Destination like wrap up the the thing of which that is kind of concluding the first story, maybe we then can be uh, free of all this, or maybe not. So they have to eventually come up with a strategy to take down the entity, the Polaroid monster, and so eventually they come up with something to do with that. So with that said, uh, let's just go into spoilers. Let's go ahead and break this down because it's about that time to otherwise just spoil this movie and talk about the strategy of which that I would have if I were to have been placed into this scenario. So now it is spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. One thing before we go, this movie also just feels like The Ring to me. Like if you are to watch the video, you die in 7 days. Well, this Polaroid monster isn't going to be waiting a week. He's not going to wait till the film's like developed, if you know what I mean, to go and take somebody out, because this is a Polaroid thing. So all you got to do is just kind of flip it a couple times, and then eventually the photo will show up, or just wait for it eventually to develop itself. So I actually I liked this story because it has those like retro vibes, and like also like I remember when like I would see like the last kind of Polaroid cameras kind of going out, and eventually they're just like, okay, we're never going to see this kind of thing again. But then eventually they tried to bring it back and try to do some kind of interesting things to try to bring it back, but they kind of tried to bring it back in a smaller kind of way, which wasn't a better way. It was just like, dude, people would have probably liked a Polaroid picture, but now they're getting this smaller variation of it. Anyways, so pushing on. So, now, spoilers. So, very beginning of this movie, we of course have the girl from Riverdale called Sarah, uh, who seems to be kind of rummaging through her mother's stuff and is to eventually find out about this Polaroid photo uh, camera thing. It seems that Sarah is to find this because her mother, who had passed away, had left Sarah some things, and so she's like, "Oh, like this must have been taken right before coincidentally she was to die. I wonder why." So Linda is to kind of mention. It seems like there's to be some like Linda, who's friends of Sarah, who's with her in this room, is to mention it seems like there are photos going around of girls dressing in lingerie to appease their boyfriends. And so Sarah is like, well, I guess I should be on the trending thing. And so Sarah decides to go and dress in lingerie, which you can't really you can't really see anything because the girl is just kind of sitting in a way of which that you like. Plus, her hair is so long, like it basically shows nothing. And plus, this is like the hallmark of horror, anyways. So it's basically just going to be like the nicest whatever photo. And plus, why would you want to like display this girl in all her glory, anyways? Because it's basically just going to be after she takes the photo. Guess what happens? Dead. So she's going to be in this movie for a very brief time. So Linda ends up taking the photo of Sarah, and then she's like, "Oh, well, that's a nice one." And so eventually Linda is to leave for one reason or another. So eventually Sarah is to go up because she ends up hearing noises in her attic. So Sarah has to go up into her attic to eventually find there's seemingly some monsterish thing in there. Eventually, there's to be hand that ends up grabbing at Sarah. So Sarah decides that she's going to get the F out of her attic, and then eventually the monster ends up grabbing her anyways and killing her. And that seems to be the very beginning of this movie. So transition us into I've been watching a lot of videos of a certain kind of YouTuber that ends up saying transition in that same exact way. So eventually I was like, transition, just because he says it that way. Anyways, pushing on. So, uh, whoa. So we are to have this guy who is to be, I guess, running this antique store. A guy named Tyler. Tyler is to go and give his girl named Bird this Polaroid thingy, Polaroid camera. And because this girl just loves to take photos, it seems like this girl is to be at school and just be taking pictures of people. And so Tyler is to give her this Polaroid thing, and it's to say like, well, hey, like it seems like there is one Polaroid picture in there left. How about you take one of me if you're not going to take one of yourself? So Bird goes and takes a picture of Tyler, and so guess what's gonna happen? This guy's gonna die soon. So Bird goes off and goes to school. It seems that Tyler is to mention to Bird, like, hey, like, you conveniently don't have the case with you. You're going to probably need this case because you're going to find out that this was involved in some murder some years ago. So Tyler is to also, before Bird is to leave, Tyler is to try and kiss Bird, and eventually he is to realize what a mistake that was, and he's like, well, I guess, like, you and me aren't meant to be, because evidently Bird is just like, nah. So, Bird is to eventually go off, because evidently it's class picture day, and so she's to be wearing a scarf, and she ends up being called Scarf Girl. And so eventually Bird is to go off and take this one picture of a guy named Connor. And so, like, Connor ends up kind of looking at Bird, just kind of like, okay, why did she take my picture? Or why did she take any number of any one of these people's pictures? That's okay, all right, whatever. Like, maybe any number of us, like, she's interested in. But maybe Connor is like, well, I'm single, so I might as well just see if it was me she was taking the picture of. So, uh, but she doesn't do that with the Polaroid picture. She takes it with her digital camera thing that she is to have. So we push on to eventually have Tyler die after he is to go on and be watching this projectional slideshow. And so Tyler is watching this projectional slideshow, which eventually is to have a monster of sorts creeping into the photos. And so Tyler is like, whoever pulled that off, like, nice moves. So all of a sudden, Tyler is to be kind of being more and more creeped out by this slideshow because he's testing this projector to eventually find himself dead afterwards. So Bird evidently is to be having her friend wanting to have her go to this Halloween party, going and giving her this Red Riding Hood costume. And so Bird is like, really? Red Riding Hood? And her friend is just like, well, hey, like, if you can find a better costume that you can come up with in a very brief amount of time, then by golly, just come up with something. So Bird just quickly gives up and is like, well, I guess I'm Red Riding Hood. Well, I'm going to wear my yellow scarf for the 18th time in this movie. So Bird goes off and just easily just wears the Red Riding Hood costume. And so she ends up going to this party to eventually bump into this skeleton guy who's also wearing a cloak, coincidentally costume. And so we end up finding out that it's Connor. And so Connor is to mention to Bird, like, hey, like, how did the film go? How was the film developed? Because obviously you were taking some photo that I was in. And Bird was like, well, yeah, I guess I was. Because maybe Bird possibly knows that, or maybe Connor knows that Bird is interested in him. But I don't know, maybe they're just kind of playing fast and loose with this. So eventually what ends up happening is all the friends end up kind of getting together and they're like, hey, like I think we should probably just try to like all try and take a photo all together. And like they were trying to do like the cell phone where they're like, hey, yeah, we should definitely try and like try to get like, oh man, like we should really distance ourselves and we should and so Burr just makes the thing of just like, well, hey, like I have this like Polaroid camera with me. How about we take this kind of photo instead? It's kind of retro and whatever, but it's kind of fun. And they're like, well, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So Bird ends up taking the photo, and they're like, well, why don't you like try to figure out a way to like get yourself in the photo? It's like, well, there's no timer, I guess, in this camera or whatever. And she's like, well, no, I like better to just kind of like take the photo instead of being in the photo. So, but eventually we'll find out later on that she's in the photo anyways, because technically there's a mirror behind these people, or there's a thing of glass in the background of this photo. So weirdly, you end up getting the reflection of this girl's face in the glass in the background. Weirdly, so technically she's in the photo barely. So these people go and they take the photo. One girl is to photobomb the photo. So now, like, these people are to eventually just go home and after this party. And so we end up having this one girl who I believe is to be Avery. Avery ends up going home to eventually go into her house to eventually get a really bad problem with her neck. Meaning, this monster goes and grabs this woman by the face and basically just snaps her neck exorcist style, where her head is completely around her back. So this girl ends up after being in the party is to die horrifically that way. And so now at the school that she is in, because this is a high school story, they end up going and having a candlelight visual and all this stuff at the school. Just kind of like, oh man, this is so bad that all these kids just died recently. And so all of a sudden Bird is finally making the consensus by having all these photos here. She's like, oh my god, I think they're dying because of these photos. So Bird is to eventually showcase this at the lunch table with all of her friends to just be like, hey, like I think like these people are dying because of these photos. And so we end up having Devin, ever the smart guy, is to just be like, well, let me reset here for a second. Evan is to make the idea of like, well, here's how we can eventually just kind of take care of this. And so Devin goes and he is to take a lighter to the photo and say, okay, problem solved. So all of a sudden the photo is starting to burn, and so all of a sudden Devin's girlfriend is to eventually get up because she's realizing that her hands are starting to be smoking. Not like the Jim Carrey kind, but like she's really just starting to burst into flame within her arm. And so now they're trying to like douse her arm out, and they're grabbing a fire extinguisher and trying to like fire extinguisher this girl's hand, but the flames aren't going out. And so all of a sudden there's to be another girl that's starting to have her hands starting to burn, as well as some parts of her face, as well as her hair. So all of a sudden Bird is to realize that she's going to go and try to dampen the flames of the picture out, and all of a sudden that resolves this problem, and eventually all the characters start to go to the hospital. And so what happens is after after the photo is to seemingly be like doused out, eventually the photo goes back to normal, like as if nothing ever happened to it. So it's like, okay, that's strange. So So eventually they go to the hospital, and so it's like, okay, well, like somebody's probably going to die in this hospital, right? Or everyone's going to die miraculously at the same time. Or you would have possibly thought that this photo would have completely burnt up, and then everyone would have just horrifically died all in one shot. But I guess not. So now that we're at this hospital and they're going back um, to kind of make sure that this one girl with this burnt arm is going to be okay. Devin is to basically blame Bird for this whole situation and that he's probably going to die soon because of Bird. And here is the strategy that I would have gone with. I would have gone with continuing to take people's photos because then that would have been delaying the death. Because it seems like the entity keeps shifting from photo to photo to photo to photo. So if there would have been an endless amount of developing of photos that would have happened here, you could have really just kept like switching it from friend to friend to friend, taking their photo, and then you would have had plenty of time to come up with a strategy to eventually figure out how to take this thing down. But they didn't do that. Like, I think at one point we have Devin who ends up taking his photo, realizing that the entity had shifted to his photo, and so Devin ends up taking a picture of his, or tries to take a picture of his friend, so that way he can avoid dying. And I'm like, yeah, that's what you should have done. You should have continued to hot potato the camera to try to figure out how you can just avoid this thing called death until you could figure out the backstory of this. Like, when really looking at it, like I don't know how many kind of horror movies would try to consistently do that, but they didn't. Like eventually, I think Final Destination tried to consistently try to stop certain people that were dead on the God, what was it? The flight seat list. They figured out the flight seat list, and they figured out who was going to die next by the flight seat list. So you would have thought that they would have tried to figure out how to better understand who was going to die next via XYZ photos. You think that they would have done that, but no. Instead, like they should have. Anyways, pushing on. But the real actual answer that you could have easily figured out was all they had to do was take a picture of the entity and then take and kill or crush or burn that photo, and then problem solved. Like, that was the thing that I was immediately thinking, like, at least a good, like, quarter into this film. Because I wasn't thinking at first, I was just enjoying the movie, but I'm like, oh yeah, you can just easily take a photo of the entity and donezo. Like, I think around the time where they were talking about the photos and then the guy burnt the picture, I was like, oh, so that's how they're gonna like resolve this. Like, they're foreshadowing how to finish this up. And like, okay, cool. Because like they kind of showcase the power of each photo. Plus, we also get a moment where one of the characters goes and stabs into the one of the photos, like a voodoo kind of thing, to all of a sudden have one of the characters, who is Devin, just be kind of just, what the heck happened? How is it all of a sudden I have blood on my hands? Because someone stabbed into your photo to get you to stop doing what you're doing, because Devin eventually got so like afraid and so upset that eventually he just eventually had to be kind of like voodoo wise taken care of. Anyways, pushing on. So back at the hospital. So Devin is blaming Bird for what had happened here, and so eventually Bird goes off with Connor to mention, it's like, well, yeah, like, I guess I am always at fault, because Bird is to eventually go into this story about her and her father, because the sheriff had mentioned that Bird was such a brave girl. And at one point, which I was like, that is such a weird thing to say. Like, and plus, also, you would have thought they would have came up with that story right then and there. Um, but they just kind of made it so like vague. And I was like, you would have thought they would actually, like the sheriff would have actually said something, but he didn't. And so the girl had to say the story later on to Connor. So Bird is to mention that her and her father, like her father was to take Bird out to some sleepover, and so Bird's father was wanting to show Bird some project that he was working on, and Bird was just a little B word and was like, no, I don't want to see that. Like, I don't care. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't want to know what you're doing. I don't want to know what you're working on. But what if Bird's father was working on a home for Bird to live in the future? Like, maybe he was like putting together her like a log cabin house that he's just built by hand, and like and so like this girl could have a home in her future that she can live in forever, just off the grid and whatever. And Bird is like, I don't care, I don't want to know. And so all of a sudden, like her father is like, well, okay, like I guess like you don't want to know what the project is because you don't care about anything. Like she just wants to go to her sleepover. So eventually Bird's father is eventually kind of adjust the car to eventually get into a car accident where like I guess her father had died. And I'm like, this is kind of the most like stereotypical movie. Like this kind of feels like another one of those like romance kind of app kind of stories where it's just kind of the most like, how predictable can this movie be, or how like kind of I want to say this in the right way. I want to say it's like formulaic, or just kind of like the blandest movie that they could have come up with, and they probably could have taken this whole entire idea from some kind of story app somewhere. But I guess that's just me. Oh yeah, pushing on. So what ends up happening is Devin is to go and try to find his girly friend, to eventually go and find her and want to kind of like push the curtain of where this girl is to be sleeping. Can't even say the word sleeping right. My apologies. To find that this girl is to be seemingly hung, dead, having a noose around her neck. And so Devin is like, "Oh my god, you killed my girlfriend because she's forced to die because of this whole photo thing." And so now they're just like, "Well, hey, there's nothing we can do about this. Like people are eventually forced to die. It's just bound to happen." So eventually both Connor and Bird decide that they want to go and figure out the whole origin story of this camera. And so eventually they go and they find the cover thing for this camera, to eventually find out that it's involved in some homicide from a certain specific year. And so they're like, well, okay, now we have to go through the newspaper clippings and find out like what was like something that was camera related within X amount of year. So they go on to end up finding this story that there was a certain number of teens that were to be tied to this whole Polaroid camera story. So they're like, okay, so now we have to go to the wife of this guy named Roland and figure out what this story really was. So both Bird and Connor eventually go on to find this old lady, because Bird is actually in the camera also. So eventually this entity is going to eventually go after her at some point. But yeah, so both Bird and Connor go to this woman who's to be Lena, to find out this backstory. That what she ends up saying is that there was to be these couple of teens that were to supposedly be friends with this girl named Rebecca. Evidently, Rebecca was to supposedly be this girl that was to supposedly be mentally slow or something like that. And so it seems like this other group of teens supposedly took advantage of her and supposedly took inappropriate photos of her and then plastered it all over school, to where all of a sudden this girl ended up taking her own life because of the humiliation that she was to be involved in. So Roland, who was her father, took it upon himself to go after every single one of these teens, uh, with revenge on his mind, to go after every single one of these teenagers to kill them all off. And so eventually Roland, who ended up uh, getting caught doing this, like getting caught going after the very last person, ended up going into this dark room, where eventually he fell into this vat of liquid that ended up coincidentally getting electrified, and he ended up dying. So really, we're just to naturally assume that the killer of all this is to be this Roland character, and he is to be the monsterish thing. So now, supposedly, Lena is to have this photo of the last person who eventually was to be involved in this. And so both Bird and Connor decide that they want to go and try to uh, break into their school to kind of thumb through the yearbook, to find the specific year that this was involved in, to eventually find out that this person was none other than the sheriff. Uh, and it is kind of interesting because Devin was forced to eventually spend the night in prison, uh, because eventually Devin had done something um, badly to just kind of accuse him of going into a prison cell. And so sadly, Devin ends up dying in prison. So eventually the kids go and break into but like Bird and Connor try to explain this to the sheriff, and sheriff is like, I don't believe this story. There's no way this is even true. And so eventually, when the two characters are to eventually go to the school, break into it to try to look in through the yearbooks, eventually the sheriff is to be there to be like, hey, you guys are breaking into the school. Like, I guess I'm going to have to arrest you because you're breaking and entering. So both Bird and Connor explain the story and know the whole like backstory of it all. And the sheriff is like, well, you didn't even get the story right. Uh, and both Bird and Connor end up taking a picture of the sheriff, so that way he'll be the last one for this entity to go after, and so hopefully this whole thing will get resolved. So, but the sheriff mentions like, well, hey, you didn't tell the story right. The Lena, the woman that you got this story from, like she's just been blaming any number of these teens for this whole problem, and it's not even true. The real story is that supposedly Roland had been the one taking photos, I guess, of his daughter Rebecca, and the teens found out about it, and they decided to want to rescue Rebecca from this whole thing. And so Roland, who ended up getting upset about all this, started to go after the teens, and eventually Rebecca had felt so horrified about that whole moment that eventually these teens were trying to rescue her, that eventually she decided afterwards that after this whole thing happened, that she decided to take her own life afterwards. So the sheriff is like, anybody could eventually tell you exactly when Rebecca was to die, and it was because of people finding out about what her father had done. It wasn't about the humiliation of us taking photos of her. because that didn't actually happen. So you got the story wrong. So what ends up happening is Sheriff is the latest person to be on this Polaroid picture. So all of a sudden the entity is to appear and to take the sheriff's picture and to tear it in half, which then rips the sheriff in half and kills him off, of course. So now we end up having it to where everybody's kind of running off to eventually go and try to get away from this entity, hoping that they're not next. So eventually, Bird and I believe Casey are to eventually run off to make it to these showers, and they are to try to put on the hottest water that they can possibly put on, because this entity's weakness is evidently to be against heat. So this entity doesn't like to, of course, get any further into the shower. So eventually Bird is like, well, hey, Casey, you're going to be safe. Just stay in the shower. And I'm going to run off to try and find Connor because I think I have a plan of how to defeat this. So Bird ends up running off to Connor to eventually mention, it's like, hey, I figured it out. Like, if anything, we need to finally go and figure the best place for this entity to show itself in the best way and take a photo of it. So Bird goes off into this dark room, and so I guess that's going to be the perfect spot for this entity to really just fully show itself. So Bird goes into this dark room, I guess this massive dark room, because why would this dark room be so big? I've been into certain schools where eventually they have a dark room. It's freaking small. Like, it's basically the size of 1 to 2 or at least 3 people in one room. So I don't know why this dark room is so massively big, because I guess they have some action moments to go in here. So they end up having to find like the biggest dark room they could find. So anyways, so what ends up happening is Bird is to eventually be grabbed by this entity, because I guess she used to be next. So eventually Bird is to try to take a photo of this entity, and it seems that she ends up getting a quite a massive amount of this entity in the photo. I'm like, I'm sorry, I wouldn't think you would get the whole, like a mass of this thing in this photo. So but she also gets her fingers caught in the photo also. So, and it's coincidentally like a massive amount of fingers in this photo also. So, at first, Bird is to try and crush the photo, which also crushes her fingers, but like this entity just is to eventually just start to crumble into a pretzel. And so eventually Bird is to think like, oh, maybe this will be the way that I can just take this thing down. And no, it just kind of reforms back up, because eventually the photo kind of reforms to be this perfect photo. And so Bird is like, well, hey, now I need to burn it. And so Bird eventually is to burn this picture, as well as burning her fingers and burning the entity. So eventually the entity is to burn up, and so that's what solves this whole thing. And she's like, oh, thank God, now this whole thing is over, or what they are led to believe. So eventually what ends up happening is that we have Casey, who's mentioned like, yeah, I'm never going to photobomb a photo again. Like, you would think that none of these people would ever want to take another photo of themselves ever again. And so the very last bit of this, we have Bird, who ends up taking this Polaroid camera and chucking it into the water, which I'm like, okay, this is going to immediately like spurn off probably a sequel movie, because eventually someone is going to eventually find this camera into the deepest, darkest part of ocean somewhere, and they're eventually going to be like, hey, like, isn't this cool? I found this Polaroid camera. Like, let's see if I can kind of refurbish this. and use it. And like I'm assuming that that was going to be like something that they were going to do in this movie to just kind of keep the thing alive. That eventually there's going to be another film, but they didn't. So eventually that's just how the movie ends, with seemingly a happy ending. That not all these characters eventually die at the end of this. Uh, so yeah, that's basically how the movie just ends. Um, so yeah, with that said, that's all I wanted to say about this movie. And so yeah, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.